Hi, welcome to Brass Matters. I'm John Wallace, and if you don't know me, I'm obsessed with incredible performers, chance discoveries, and unexpected musical treasures. John Miller and I have been playing together forever. We were both brought up in the same oral tradition of the brass band and came through virtually the same formal education. When listening to recordings of us playing together, even I can't tell the difference between us. Whenever I think, that sounds good, it turns out to be the other John. So joining me this week to talk about 3 premiere recordings released today, and plenty more besides, we're both good talkers, is John Miller. So the International Trumpet Guild and the conference in Salt Lake City has brought us together again, and with these duets to think about, where we come from and how far back. We started off playing together in the Tullis Russell Mills Junior Band in the mid-1950s, so our careers seem to have been in sync ever since. How did that happen?
Goodness knows, but both of our families were involved in brass banding. Your father was a member of Tullis Russell Mills Band for was it 60 years? Or something.
70.
It was 70, yeah, which is amazing. And
yeah.
I remember your uncles being active.
Uncle Charlie.
In my case, I had a brother who was in Tullis Russell Mills Band. Now he was a sort of very interesting learner. He was very bright. So because he was so bright, he preferred to play the instrument with his left hand rather than the right, just to keep himself amused.
Yes.
And if he was learning scales, or if he was telling me how to play the next scale, he would tell me how to play it back to front. So so very soon when I started my learning, I could do do it back to front, left-handed,
Yes.
And we sort of learned that way, But the youth band. Were there about 40 in it? I think it was quite...
The junior band, there was 40, and Geordie Baxter used to come in off the back shift as an electrician with his overalls covered in grease and stuff, and take us. Yeah, and do you remember him saying to Billy Hogg, who was sitting back, he said, "Billy, what's a white circle, a white thing with a black tail?" And Billy said, "Oh, it's a pussycat, Mr. Baxter." And it was the old-fashioned teaching where he used to single out people, to do things and so on. But it was highly effective, wasn't it? So many players came out of that. There's 40 of us stuck in that band hall, and was it Izzy used to come with the tiara, and she was a woman. She must have been about 4'3". And when I think back to how she was dressed, it was like going back to the middle of the 19th century, wasn't it? Really?
Oh yeah, with an apron on and so on, But I think with the learning things, you learn by osmosis. And in my case, there was this boy. Wallace boy, he was about a couple of years in front of me, and he could play things. If I practiced, I could play it almost as well. Then what he would do, he would practice a little bit faster, so that he'd come back up a little bit faster the next week. So he was leading by an example, and this whippersnapper here, I kept on trying to catch up. And of course you never quite can, But that's a great thing in learning, when there's somebody just ahead of you that gives you encouragement or enticement or a little bit of competition. It's a good thing.
But it's amazing the nicknames that you come up with as well. Like your family had the reputation of being cheeky, so your dad was called Old Pork. Old Pork. Your brother Davy was called Pork, and you were called Wee Pork.
Wee Pork.
Because Porky.
Yeah.
So that I could just remember there was always this sort of sense of devilment in everything that you did, And when I heard you doing what you could do, I just thought, wow, he can play. I'm going to have to go home and practice so I could get better than him,
Yeah.
And I think that competition thing is
Yes,
really
yeah.
quite good. It wasn't long before we were playing in the quartets and
Yeah,
stuff
yeah, yeah.
together
Yeah,
as well.
but there was another thing that happened in our youth at schools. We went to different schools, but both of our music masters at school, they were very sort of visionary. They had ambition for us both. And your music teacher really sort of got you to apply for the National Youth Orchestra.
That's
And
right, yes.
then I did the same thing. I think it was maybe couple of years later,
Yeah.
3 years later, and we both got in. And that's an incredible learning environment.
But the
being
next-
with Ernest Hall,
Yeah, it was incredible. But the next thing was that I was doing the Haydn with Rudolf Schwarz on a European tour, and then after that, you did the Hummel concerto, and nobody had played a trumpet concerto before in this, and they wee boys from Fife, the Ruth Railton and then Ivy Dixon, who were running things, they seemed to take a shine to working class boys from the other side of the track coming and playing the trumpet, especially it's talking in an incomprehensible, Fife accent.
Well, this pockishness, I suppose, and the angelic appearance, it sort of helped, I think, maybe. But I suppose that was the first, and whether that was a coincidence or not, I don't really know. But it's astonishing that we both played similar concerti with an Austrian conductor, Rudolf Schwarz. He was an extraordinary. I mean, for me, it was a little bit like playing with Gustav Mahler, because he was mannered with his hair sort of brill creamed back, and he smoked a sort of very elegant cigarette with a cigarette holder and all this. And I'd never really met anybody of that sort of status in my life. It was incredible.
And it was so far from where we came from because we lived about a mile apart. I was just across the river leaving in the new part of Glenrothes Woodside, and you were in Markinch. And we later discovered that your mum and my dad were both born in the same house in Colton of Balgony, next to the blacksmith's smithy. And so our family were probably second cousins or something, but it was a very, very close-knit community growing up in the brass band. And there seemed to be a brass band activity every weekend. We were going in for contests. And do you remember my granddad at Denbeath, how he used to come and support you and me?
He had this theory that you couldn't really play properly unless you were very well fed.
That's right.
And the one of the staples was soup, and they used to call it kale, like kale. They used to call soup kale. So he would say, "Eat that kale," and then once you'd eat kale, you were kind of ready to play. You were nourished.
You can't play a brass instrument with an empty stomach.
That's it.
That's what he used to say.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh.
That's it.
Oh God!
But you see, the next thing that happened, it was a consequence of those school music teachers, because the school music teachers, they were, I think they were very enlightened. They'd been trained. I mean, my teacher, he was trained at the Royal Scottish Academy of Music. And I don't know where Albert Cochrane.
He was at Edinburgh University. He was in the same class as Thea Musgrave, and he was he'd missed out a lot from having to go to Burma in the war in the gliding squadron and so on, and he in a gliding accident he severed sort of some part of his hand, so he couldn't play again. So he put everything into the school, and we used to do operas in the school, Carmen, the Bartered Bride, Gluck's Orfeo, and it was just a fantastic education. And then he sent for the papers for Cambridge, for King's College, Cambridge. Yeah, nobody had ever been to university before, and from our school, for somebody to go to something other than St Andrews University was like sacrilege. And anyway, I did the exam, and I never thought I'd get in, and got in, and it was incredible. And then shortly
Then
afterwards, you did the same thing,
did the
didn't
same
you?
thing. I was encouraged to do so, and I didn't really have any. I didn't have any um, views on it, but it seemed to be a good thing because there were many people that were in this National Youth Orchestra that we were in. A lot of them went to Cambridge. I mean, a lot of them had been at posh schools, which I was not. But I think the Cambridge thing, it was good. It was good for me because the course itself, it was quite flexible, let's say.
It was flexible, and the thing was that instrumental playing beyond organ and keyboard didn't play a part in the course at all. So all of our playing, I was playing in concerts all of the time, and I suppose it was the same for you. None of that counted, but with all of the people doing, it was like, David Atherton and Andrew Davis and Mark Elder and all of these sorts of people who were there at the time. So it was, Ruth Railton had this theory that conservatoires, or the conservatoire type places, were dead, and that people should go to university and broaden their minds and just take lessons, And in a way, maybe she was right at that time. I think the whole scene has changed now, a lot. But it's amazing, all of the instrumentalists who went to Cambridge and did the undergraduate there, and that was in the late 60s for me, and that was a different sort of experience. And the the contacts that I made then, I'm still in contact with them. It opened a new universe for me, And then I went to London, and you went to New York, and
But I think to say about that period was that work was plentiful, in Britain. So I think that probably you and I and others, we had opportunities that were quite unusual, because I remember about that period there was a big shift around in the trumpet world, and one of the shift arounds was that the player in the London Philharmonic, Gordon Webb, he went to the Sydney Opera House. So he made a move. Elgar Howarth, he left the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, and he went to the London Sinfonietta, and then became a chamber music player, and he was very involved in the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble. But he gave up the trumpet in 1976. Howard Snell, he was the principal trumpet and the chairman of the London Symphony Orchestra. He was a big thinker, and he made a move to conduct brass bands in the north of England, and he became the head of brass at the Royal Northern College of Music. And I'm just wondering if there were any other shifts arounds.
I think there were some quite big shifts, but that was around about the time we got involved in orchestras as well, and we seemed to sort of coincide in the Philharmonia together, Yeah.
And it was that was a good time.
Good time. The conductors as well were so full of ideas, like that Andre Previn, the LSO, who was popularizing classical music and appearing on the Morecambe and Wise show, and Andre Previn's music night, and then Riccardo Muti coming into the Philharmonia and revolutionizing orchestral standards. Really,
He was
such a bastard.
Oh
wasn't he?
yeah. But
And
he was
so good to work for.
He was like a new kid on the block.
Uh-huh.
He was a sort of a rising star, and hasn't he done well? It's incredible,
Yes,
But he used to terrify. He certainly used to terrify me.
I said, remember the first thing he said to you when you were sitting in the orchestra? He noticed a new face, and you play. You had it was some Prokofiev we were playing, and he stopped the orchestra and tapped his thing. Poco più, more nice sound, please, seconda tromba.
That was his name for me. Yes, seconda tromba. Yeah, yeah. But in addition to him, there was the Sinopoli came, and there were visitors. Lorin Maazel.
Yeah,
he was he was incredible.
We did just Mahler
Just
tonight,
just a bit incredible technician, and I found I could sit and watch him all day long. Just all these gestures with his hands and his eyeballs.
Do you remember one summer we recorded Tosca 3 times with different conductors, and everybody used to conduct it so expressively, and Maazel used to subdivide it into 16 and stuff, so that it was exact. The rubato was sort of, just so precise.
The very opposite of that was Giulini, Carlo Maria Giulini, and he was the opposite. He didn't really do very much, but you would be. I always found I was fascinated with his expressiveness. And once I think you would have been busy doing something else, but I was looking after it was a Beethoven symphonies with Giulini, and he sort of looked at me and he sort of gestured with his left hand. It was just like that, one finger. That was that, and that set the dynamic for the fortnight. So I didn't need to be told anything more. He was saying, just keep within the sonority. Don't really want to hear you too much.
I remember that Giulini used to conduct everything measurably slower than everybody else, and it sounded so good because of the depth of sound,
Yeah, that's interesting. The tastes. Yeah. I don't know how that would sound today.
And then at one stage you went to New York to study with Vacchiano, and you've just sort of retraced your footsteps to New York. How did that go, retracing all those memories from 50 years ago?
Well, that was a very fascinating experience because really to wind the clock back, I was really sent to the USA by Philip Jones and Elgar Howarth. They thought that would be a very good thing to do because at that time, I think that in Britain, I think there was less known about how particular players played so well. And I'm thinking about people like Vacchiano and the people in Chicago who played so beautifully. I think that Jones and Howarth, they just wanted to find out how it was done. Now, the pair of them, they were very struck by a visit of the New York Brass Quintet in 1963. And, really, the American thing was a very big inspiration, and I think that continues to be the case. So I was the first person to be sent on that journey. So Vacchiano, it was fascinating because the first thing that he sort of touched on was the fact that I was a Scotsman, and he had come to Edinburgh Festival in 1956. And he was very struck with Edinburgh, went out and bought a Harris tweed jacket, which he still wore. He still wore it in the 1970s. And whenever I came in the door, he'd always sing, "There'll always be an England." That was his opening line with me, But he always had nicknames for people. But he thought with me, he said, well, for a start, Miller, he said, you're playing with lead boots on. He felt that the mouthpiece I played on was far too big because I played in it was a number 1. And that's what everybody played on in London, because in London we played very, very large mouthpieces and small instruments. We just liked that sort of sound. And I think we believed that in orchestral playing, you needed quite a bit of muscularity. To make enough power, and you needed to be able to get your lips almost inside the mouthpiece so you could control the intonation. And I have found that to be the case since then, because if the mouthpiece is too small for me, it makes me just go a bit sharp. If I'm tired, I go sharp and out of tune, and it drives me bonkers. So I've persisted in a sense with larger mouthpieces, but that was one thing. But Vacchiano, he had a certain method in his teaching, and if you just did what he said, week by week by week, you'd advance. And that was the fascinating thing. He had a system, and I think that system was very similar to the Schlossberg system. It was just learning in small, achievable increments. Now, halfway through the year, I sort of took the train over one night, overnight train to Chicago, and I had 6 months with Vince Chikovitz. And he was a different type of player. He emphasized not the embouchure, not the mouthpiece, but he emphasized the airflow. And that was new to me. That was really new to me, because previous to that, I think I'd been pretty much grilled on diaphragm and support. And this I could continue a lot about that.
Yes.
But the Chicago viewpoint was a little bit. It was the converse. And I soon found out that there's more than one way to play the trumpet. And I guess I came home eventually, and I had a slightly hybrid view.
Yeah.
And your view, I think, when you're a player and when you're a teacher or a player, it alters, it matures over the years, But I've never forgotten those two approaches.
Great, and I believe you went back to the Bronx near where Schlossberg used to live, and you played with the Lehman Concert Band and the Yonkers Philharmonic Orchestra last week. What was that like?
Well, it was a thrill for me, because I was back on my old stomping ground. I mean, when I was in New York, I used to live up near the Cloisters at 200th Street, and sometimes at dead of night, I would go out with my flatmate and we'd play trumpet duets on the George Washington Bridge, or we'd go to Inman Park, because the neighbours didn't complain there, So we could play trumpet duets at 3 a.m, as you do when you're a student. Uh-huh. When I played in the community orchestra, I was sat next to a man, 88 years old, and playing very well. And he was a Vacchiano student, so we interchanged a few stories. And I sort of said, "Well, did you know Schlossberg?" He said, "No, I don't know Schlossberg, but my father used to play poker with him." So you're never far away from history. My PhD, which I'm just completing right now, is about performance practice. And performance practice, I think it's partly steered by the context of your learning. So I had part of this learning in Fife, in the brass band, learning orally from others, just copying, and it was a good thing to copy, because the players there, they actually played tunes. Most of the repertoire was based on tunes, Italian opera and so on. So that was a good thing. But when we sort of went from there into the National Youth Orchestra together, we were under the influence of Ernest Hall. Now, Ernest Hall, he was a very consummate player and teacher, but he was traditional and thorough. Now, he didn't let you play with any vibrato, and he could play a beautiful line, but there wasn't a hint of a vibrato in it. It was very much forbidden, So it was a different way of playing, and I think to this day, I think that his style of playing, it influences the way that I play classical music.
And do you think it influences the way a lot of we British players play, even the Ernest Hall approach?
I think it does. It's inevitable, because Ernest Hall, he learned from those who were before him, John Solomon, and I think you can trace it back to the Harpers, in
Walter
the 19th,
Morrow,
and Walter Morrow, of course,
lessons from,
Yeah, you can trace it back. But for example, Ernest Hall, he taught Philip Jones, and he taught our dear colleague David Mason, who we sat next to us in the Philharmonic Orchestra, and he taught also Malcolm Arnold.
Yeah.
And David Mason, he taught a lot of people at the Royal College of Music,
So that DNA
it's a big influence.
Yeah.
And I would say that it's a particular type of playing. It's, I mean, I suppose we might say it's what we would say proper playing.
Probably it does.
It's a little bit like when you're having a cup of tea, you put your pinky up so that you're very polite.
It does feel cultured, but I'll never forget my first encounter with the American style of playing and the extrovert American style of playing and virtuosic, and I think that had, like the New York Brass Quintet had a great effect. I think the way, the work ethic of American players, and I went into all of the Claude Gordon books and all of the methods and went all the way through them at triple high C in 37 weeks and all of that sort of thing. And I just found that again, those training techniques were almost like the Czech long distance or middle distance runners training techniques of the 1950s that absolutely revolutionized athletics and performance standards. And I feel that that American methodology and also the critical mass of players there just lifted the level, and for orchestral players to attain. And it staggers me now to this day to listen to some of the young British players who are in orchestras, invariably young, how good they are, how much better they are than we used to be. And it seems, our pathetic efforts after listening to, but they still play, and it's always surprised me how cultured orchestral sections sound these days. I went to an LSO concert last year, and I was staggered. I mean, when I was in the LSO, it used to be Sturm und Drang. It used to be all, really, really sort of big a lot of the time. And this was on a different, different level. Now, are you partially responsible for this then, where we've got to? Because you've taught so many people, from the Guildhall to the Northern, Alison Balsam and so on. And there seems to be a different British culture in playing now. It's, and you listen to the LSO, trombone section now, it's so cultured. In my day, it was the oxyacetylene twins, Peter Gain and Dennis Wick behind you. It was like raw flesh,
But that would, I think if you go there, you go back to probably the 1960s and the 1970s, and if you think 1960s, Dennis Wick, the trombonist, he bought his first con trombone. It was big, and that was kind of a little bit of a consequence of the New York Philharmonic, with what was it, Gordon Tullis and Van Haney and Ostrander coming to the Edinburgh Festival in 1956 with Vacchiano, of course, and they had this thing about playing bigger instruments because they thought it could do more, and they believed in it. And I think with that, we both knew Dennis Wick very well, and he had a particularly effective and analytical way of teaching brass, and that spread to everybody, So his he affected the whole thing. He affected the trumpet world as well. And I think there were other people at that time, like John Ridgeon, much less known, but he was one. He was a guy who he brought some ideas about playing that was efficient and well thought out. That was a new thing. Was really sort of thinking about methods of playing.
Yeah, but it amazed me as well that now we're in the days of the internet and Facebook and all the rest of it, and so what's going on in other parts of the world. But even back then, when I was having lessons from Sid Ellison at the Royal Academy of of music. They knew what was going on in New York and other places. And although Sid Ellison's favorite sort of like trumpet lesson was sort of how to put a motorbike engine together in your front room, he didn't like to talk about trumpets. I remember him taking me through excerpts and all the rest of it, and he says, "Oh yeah, rum, pagadum, bum, 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 rum." The Oberon sort of thing. He said, Vacchiano. He has a cheat valve for that. He has an ascending fourth valve on his C trumpet to play that. So even Sid Ellison, who was the third trumpet in the LPO, knew what was going on in the New York Philharmonic section.
I think there was a definite curiosity, but I mean, I think it was probably then that playing became more international than it was previously. And I think another big thing that happened around that time was that Maurice Andre came and played a couple of times in Britain. And Adolf Scherbaum as well. He came to the Edinburgh Festival, and
the Brandenburg in the second half.
Yeah.
Was that the right way round? It was maybe the other way around.
Yeah.
But people were astounded.
Astounded, but I mean, I think the things that you were talking about, the things about training, I think they existed earlier than many players are aware. So if you go back into the 19th century, Julius Koslek, his method, it's quite astonishing. It extends the range up to a top F, and really, I would have liked to have witnessed his school when he was active as a player and teacher in Berlin, because I think he had people playing very, very strongly, and I suppose that tradition extends into the way that players in Germany and Austria play today.
Yeah, and Koslek travelled quite extensively. Like he went to the Chicago Great Exhibition, did he? And was that 1871 or something in Philadelphia and New York? And he played solos at them because he wrote all these cornet solos as well. And you've done a lot of research into Koslek, and he was the first one really to play Gabrielli as well.
Oh yeah. Certainly in modern times.
Yeah.
Was another chap was Franquin, Mary Franquin, who I suppose he succeeded Arbin at the Paris Conservatoire, or in the respect that nothing much happened in the trumpet world until Arbin died. But Franquin, he was the first of a succession of teachers that concentrated on the trumpet, and his method it's pretty rigorous, but he's wise. If you look at his methods, it says if you're practicing for an hour, you play for 5 minutes, and then you have 5 minutes off, and you let your lips rest, and then you come back and you do a little bit more, and so on. It's well thought out. And so there are historically methods that are more advanced than I previously thought.
Yes, and in these days of political isolationism, and lack of freedom of movement to work and all of the rest of it, it's amazing how Koslek came across and was the first in these trumpet sections they put together to do the first performances of the B minor Mass, at the Albert Hall with maybe Koslek on first and Morrow on second, and who was on third? John Solomon, yes, who was the first trumpet in the LSO, and they got Koslek, and it was truly international scene. And it's interesting that he called his book a Schule, there's a school as well.
Yeah. And you see, this is one of the things that's a little bit sad about what happened in Britain a few years ago, this Brexit, and because prior to Brexit, I think there was more involvement in Britain in students going and playing in the European Union Youth Orchestra, and that was a real melting pot. Sometimes you'd have a trumpet section with people from, it could be Spain, Austria, maybe Scandinavia, and they'd all muck in, they would all interchange their ideas, and learn from one another. They didn't really want to learn from old farts like me, that was for sure, you know. And you know, that's a big thing. And for me, I was able to travel around Europe and go and visit Pasi Pyränen in Helsinki and the Sibelius Academy. I could go to these places and go to Lyon and then travel. It's a little bit less smooth at the moment, you know. And then in my life, I think sort of the situation changed a little bit in that eventually I went sort of a slightly different way. And I felt that in the context of the orchestra, I'd probably done everything that I wanted to do. And although it was a wonderful era, but in I think it was 1999, I was invited to move to the north of England and become the head of brass at the Royal Northern College of Music. And I took that job because it was for me it was a point of some extraordinary change. So rather than doing all the tours abroad and concerts out of town, I was focusing myself on other matters. Now, I thought that was going to be the biggest wrench of my life, but it wasn't. I never really looked back, you know. So that was me. That was me really for about the next 14 plus years from 1999 in working up in Manchester, and I still continued to play quite a lot of chamber music until something else happened, and I think it was in about 2002, and that was involving you, John.
Yeah. Was that when I moved up to Glasgow? Yes.
And you see, I think the Manchester thing, it's quite interesting, and I'll just explain a little bit about it for those people who will be less familiar. I mean, Manchester is in the epicenter, at least it was in the epicenter of the brass band world. You know, I mean, the Black Dyke Mills Band and Fairy Aviation Band and Brighouse and Rastrick and Foden's. They're all within about sort of 30 miles of Manchester.
Spitting distance,
you know, and
Yes.
and it's quite a hub. Now, in my position, because I was the head of brass there, it was very interesting because there were players from different contexts, from different cultures, and when I went there at first, the orchestral bit was over stage left, and the brass bands were on stage right, and I didn't think that was really correct. And really, there was another funny thing. There was a little bit of a chip on shoulders attitude. You know, some of the brass banders, they felt that they weren't quite as sophisticated as their orchestral or operatic counterparts, and that was never really the case, because there were brass banders who they would come from Switzerland, and they would come and be able to produce a recital, sort of present the recital in English, a foreign language, play the recital from memory, and play contemporary music like an absolute dream. And one of the things about them was that they all knew how to stand on their hind legs and play in public. And that was an interesting place educationally. And it was interesting for me as well, because in my former life, you know, just in my younger life, and as an orchestral player and as a chamber music player, I was always terrified of speaking in public. And it was just I think that was maybe just the way I was made, you know, frankly. But I had to learn it quite quick when I went to Manchester. And I think that these days, it's not new, but I think sometimes to be a successful musician, you've got to be able to present yourself, and you've got to be able to sort of sometimes talk about the music you're playing, and so on, you know. And that, in a way, it sort of gradually nudged me little bit by bit into finding more out about our heritage, about our brass heritage. And that sort of, I suppose what I'm getting to is the research word,
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's what I thought, that those music colleges and conservatoires should be aiming at the high end, high level research that percolates down in new repertoire for all the kids coming in at the other end to be to be playing. It's a healthy research environment, like like the Sibelius Academy, which since the 1990s has required all of its teachers to take a PhD, to be studying their subject. It's like continuous of development, and it just seems, a lot of people might think it's too serious-minded, but my goodness, if you want public money, I think you have got to be fairly serious-minded. And if you want your art form to persist, it has to be always exploring new things. Yeah.
It's funny because, it's quite ironic that the period of my life when I was at Cambridge University, I think I was much more interested in drinking beer and interested in girls than I was in doing academic research. But I took to academic research in my 60s, that came much, much, much later. And looking at the origins of our music and our chamber music and all that stuff, it rather intrigued me then, and I suppose I got afflicted by the bug.
Uh-huh. I know I got afflicted by it a little bit earlier in the mid-90s with Trevor Herbert and work on the Cambridge Companion to brass instruments. And then Yale University Press sort of nobbled me and said, write a book on the trumpet, which then I started. Then I got this job, and it took me until 2011 or something. It took about 14 years to write this book with Sandy McGrattan's help. So imagine how I felt when you eventually retired and you wrote your book on brass chamber music. And I think from beginning to end, it was something like 2 years it took you, like speed writing. How did you do that?
It ended up with being in speed writing, but I mean the genesis of this, I've been thinking about that type of thing for quite a long time. But you and I, we had a conversation in the garden here in 2014, and in 2014 I was sent by my institution to go and speak at the conference of the Historic Brass Society in New York. And I thought, I'll go and do this, but I'd never done that before. So I asked some information for that. And then in 2014, I remember down in the garden, you said to me, I think you can amalgamate this into a book, I'm sure, But that's what eventually that's what I decided to do. And I was spurred on into to quite an extent by my wife, who was very keen on. She was very keen on the idea. So
Keep you
keep me occupied, keep me out of mischief.
Ah.
Wishful thinking. But you see, there were many evenings at home where where she would be watching the television, and I'd be quite content just sitting writing at my computer, and that's how it got done so quickly. And what really managed to get it all wrapped up was this COVID epidemic.
Yeah.
The COVID, when everything stopped, and at that point I was able to just conclude the whole thing. So it was written up in 2 or 3 years, really.
Okay.
In the end, but it was single-minded. I didn't have any serious distractions, I would say.
Now, the COVID epidemic was really mind concentrating in that. That's what brought us together again into playing duets, because we didn't have anybody to play with. We were losing texture in our lips. So, can you remember? I mean, it's only 5 years ago now, isn't it? When did we start playing these pieces that we'd never really attempted before, like the Holloway. I'd never had the time to get it out, and I got it out one day, and I think I got on the phone to you and said, "Oh, you fancy coming up and having a go at these?"
Well, it's a great thing, playing duets is because it's very, very telling. I was relating how when I was a student in New York, I used to go and play the duets in Inwood Park and on George Washington Bridge in the middle of the night. But these things, they actually keep your chops in, and you can't stop. You've got to keep up. You've got to keep up with the music, and it's a great way to practice, because you're practicing to keep your spirit up, and to keep your momentum up, and to keep in tune. You can learn a lot about intonation just with one other person.
I know what the best thing ever is that when we settle on a final note and you can hear a third, couple of octaves below, the difference tone, and then being in that sort of harmony with one other person, there's nothing like it. I mean, the difference tones that you get playing in a brass quintet and so on are much more complex, so it's just like a buzzing in the ear, but this is sort of solid with the harmony, and the octave, that 2 octaves below thing, is just so powerful and satisfying.
It's incredible what you can hear in when there's 2 of you or a small number. I mean, I was very struck by it was a CD of music for natural trumpets that was sent over from Gil Klein from Eureka in California, and that's absolutely incredible. And that's natural trumpet music, which is quite closely recorded. And on hearing that disc, I felt that I knew and I understood the natural trumpet much better. And I think that was because of all the overtone series. I could hear it very, very well. Yeah. But I like, as well as that, I like playing to the microphone, because I like recording, and I liked making this record of the dynamic duo playing all these duets, because you can actually hear everything. It's quite unforgiving.
You can hear absolutely every note, and also I just really enjoy the recording studio environment, because it's between we two and the other pair of ears in the box, of the guy who's listening and appraising it, and you think, oh, it's marvelous, and he comes back and says, oh, that G sharp was flat and blah blah blah, and you go and listen to it and you think, oh yes, and then the satisfaction when you sharpen it up a bit and it feels right, and you have to have somebody that you can really trust, and having Bob Whitney that we've worked with forever, it's just so good, because he's like another one of the performers. And who's the Canadian pianist again? Glenn Gould, who just recorded. You can understand why he did that. It's a different medium, and you're playing it for multiple performances in situations that you can't control. People could be listening to it in their car, on their phone, have it on the hi-fi at home, and jumping around from track to track. So so it's a totally different experience.
I suppose we lived in an era where you recorded things, and recording music, it was a growing medium. But I mean, I can remember when I was just starting out, which would be sort of 50 years ago ish, and in the studio there was a chap called Bob Auger, and he was a fantastic recording engineer. He used to sit in the recording then. It was tape recorder, and it was a reel-to-reel thing. It was a lot of, I think it did about 15 inches per second. And if you split it out, he had a system where he could cut it out with a razor blade. You remember that? Yes. So sometimes he'd clean up the attacks if need be. You did think you did some things in very few takes, but he knew how to clean things up, and that was cutting edge technology. A razor blade on a little block to cut the tape and stick it together. And then later on, we were amongst the first brass groups ever to play on a CD down at Nimbus Records in Wyerston. Yeah. And that was amazing. I went out and I bought a CD player, and it was a brilliant thing. It had wooden sides. Yes. It didn't look very much like hi-fi. It looked like retro hi-fi, maybe something like that. But now I suppose the CDs they're almost obsolete. Because I sometimes speak to my students, and I said, "Have you got the CD?" And I said, "You almost didn't know what I'm talking about."
Yeah, that's why we're not going to be bringing out CDs, and they'll just be accessible on websites and on the ITG website. And so, I mean, the whole consumption of music has changed remarkably.
So it's interesting that as the technology goes one way, sometimes our musical interests go in the other direction and become quite interested with recreating historical music, on historical instruments.
Yes, and it almost goes back to, those first Equale Brass things that we did down at Wyerston Lees were one-take wonders, weren't they? Because that was, they didn't believe in editing, and Peter Bassano, his obituary was in the Times today, who started off Equale Brass. He was so good at getting us repertoire. Do you remember the Microcosmos that we recorded that he got your pal Danger Zone, yes. Martin Cotton, who worked for the BBC at that time, to do? And then you did some sardanas. Yes. We used to go to Barcelona a lot, and the dances that they did outside the cathedral every Sunday morning. You arranged a lot of these, and the repertoire that we did with Equale. Peter was always getting his pals like Ken Jones and so on, all of these composers to write us pieces. And who was the 633 Squadron guy?
Is that Ron Goodwin?
Goodwin wrote a fantastic brass quintet.
Yeah. So there's so many pieces that they're a little bit lost.
I've got them in the library.
Yeah. Yeah. If anybody who's watching this, if you want a source of repertoire, you can buy my book on the brass ensemble. It's called The Modern Brass Ensemble in 20th Century Britain, published by Boydell, the Boydell Press. And in there's a sort of a big list of published music, and a lot of it may be unfamiliar, and some of it very, very good.
So we've got 3 pieces for our colleagues in the International Trumpet Guild to listen to. There's Robin Holloway's Sonata for 2 trumpets, which was commissioned by the Guild for the 25th anniversary back in 1999. Then there's the St Jacome 12 celebrated duets, which were new to us. And then the Bellon, 3 little duets. The Holloway is in 3 movements. It's a prelude. Then the second movement is melody with echo, and then the last movement is like a fugue and an intermezzo, and it's very dynamic in the last movement, very whimsical in the first movement, and then the second movement has the sort of breadth of canvas that 2 trumpets can put into any scene when you've got one distant trumpet and one closer trumpet, and it gives you the idea of a vast expanse. And so it's within about 25 minutes. It's in a neo-romantic sort of language. It's very expressive, and it's beautiful to play, also very tiring on the lip. And I think it'll be beautiful to listen to, but be very contrasting. It'll be ear-easing rather than tiring on the ear.
Well, I mean, I think we'd had a little taste of the Holloway in, if I remember it correctly, 2014, just at the point when you were leaving the conservatoire, when there was a concert at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, and I recall that we played the middle movement together. Now that was the easy one,
Yes,
with fewer notes.
Yes.
So I'd had a taste of the music, and I knew Robin Holloway's musical language well. But when I saw the part, I thought, oh, hang on a minute, And I think you just have to get your head down and learn the thing up. Yeah. And I really enjoy a challenge of this nature. But it certainly wasn't easy.
Yeah, it was a lip buster. Yeah. And what really helped me was, listening to you, because you could play a lot of it. And it was just like going back to the junior band. I felt, wow, I'm going to have to practice this before the next time we get together. And that sort of little sort of edge in duet playing really stimulated me to practice.
Well, it's certainly better than practicing on your own. I think the life of being a professional conductor or being a professional soloist, it's pretty solitary. But this is a little bit different. But I have to say that preparing the Holloway, it necessitated a couple of trips from Lancaster up to Glasgow, so I could get the feel of it and get the feel of the demands of the stamina of the piece, And that's life, and I think it's an interesting thing, just the type of practice that you have to do in preparation for recording sessions or a concert of that nature. It's very different. It's very different to the little bits of Schlossberg that we've talked on today. I suppose it's marathon training.
And then we attempted these St Jacome 12 duets. I'd never looked at before. So what were they like for you?
Well, it's really classical music. It's classical forms. So they're all good pieces. They stand up in their own right. Either a simple sonata form or a rondo, or sometimes there's a minuet or a scherzo in trio. It's that sort of scale, and thoroughly melodic. Yeah. And occasionally you get quite interesting flashes of histrionics. There's a theme and variations, and I feel that St Jacome, or whoever actually wrote the music, they really knew what they were doing. They understood the idiom of the instrument, and I think it relates quite closely to more familiar music by Arbin.
I think what we found, though, was that when we started playing them on modern instruments, and then when we graduated backwards in time to playing them, I played them in an 1862 instrument. You played yours on a courtois, wasn't it?
Yes, it's 1870s,
yeah. 1870s. That suddenly the sound envelope, it changed. It became much warmer and much more intimate as well. And I started to feel at home then, and then all the different tones started to settle in,
There's something very natural about brass instruments, There's something, for me, there's something very physical about playing a brass instrument, and it extends to, I think it extends to the way that the sonorities match.
Yeah, And so in the Holloway, like, I played a 1960s Shilke, you played a 1990s Malone instrument, and that was much closer to the sound world that Robin wanted. And then in the third pieces, these Bellon duets. That, I'd got them out a lot and looked at them and said, oh, there's nothing in them. But when we started to play them, there was a lot in them. 9 pieces in 3 sets. And I think he said he was going to compose another, 12 afterwards. But we don't know whether those turned into what happened to them. But they are quite concise, but they don't waste a note. They're very, very precise, and what the style is, they're like Mendelssohn.
Well, I think there's lots of prominent composers that they wrote sort of simple music. Bartók, for instance, and Tchaikovsky, pieces for young players. And I suppose this is it seems a little bit like that. The pieces are progressive.
They're progressive, and it says on the title page, pour amateur, they're written for amateurs, so that obviously the cornet was in its infancy there. It had just been invented in 1833 or something like that. These were written in 1834, and it was the first tryout on these new instruments. But it's remarkable how low they go and how, fast some of it is as well, so that even though that the beginners on the instrument only had a year to get to that stage, they were actually testing them out really quite quickly, and much easier to play almost on an 1830s 2-valve.
It was a 3-valved cornet or cornopian. I can't remember specifically, but it was early, and it took quite a lot of humouring. I mean, it's funny sort of with instruments that are made sort of in today's times. You can pick them up and play, but these instruments, you needed to become at one with them.
Do you remember the first blow through it? Sounded absolutely hellish, didn't it? And then
Terrible.
To humour it and get it. And that was, what for me was how it got better and better, by.
But I think similarly, I think in this type of playing, which I suppose it's a little bit specialised, you need to find a suitable mouthpiece that matches the instruments, and that was very much the case with these cornets. They didn't work with modern mouthpieces at all. They were too supercharged.
Yes, yes.
A bit like a horse and cart with a jet engine.
A very deep mouthpiece, what we used to call potty trainers.
Yeah.
And so they were dedicated to Anton Reicher, the king of the wind quintet, and so I think Bellon was one of his favourite pupils, I think, and he deposited them it's in handwritten on a score in 1834 in the Bibliothèque Nationale, but they're very sweet, very melodic, and again, they're much more satisfying than you look on the page. You've got to realise music like that, haven't you? Yeah.
But Bellon he also wrote 12 brass quintets, and those particular brass quintets, they were written possibly in the area of 1848 to 1850 or thereabouts, and they don't really translate quite so well for the modern brass quintet, because they were devised for a soprano flugelhorn, a cornet, an early valved horn, a narrow-bore trombone, and the ophicleide. Now, the ophicleide, it's a difficult thing to translate into a modern instrument. It's a bit more like the euphonium than the modern tuba. I would say, yeah. So, possibly for that reason, these Bellon quintets have never been as popular as they deserve to be.
Yeah, and the Bellon duets, I think, will catch on if people get themselves lots of replicas of instruments made in the 1830s with two valves. Yeah, This conversation we've been having makes it seem that we've always taken music making very seriously. Where did that come from, and where did it start?
The serious music making.
Yeah.
Well, in Scotland in the 1950s and 1960s, I think brass banding, it was a serious matter. You know, you got involved in an amateur culture, and now the amateur culture, it was quite something. It was socially very, very enjoyable. It bonded you all together, but it was also bonded by its aspiration to play well.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe that's something to do with contesting. You know, contesting. I blow quite hot and cold about contesting. About a series of 12 or 16 brass bands going into a hall and playing the same piece. But my experience of contesting as a boy, it was going to the solo contests and the quartet contests and just playing anything, free choice repertoire. And for me, music, it was just music. You know, whether it was Beethoven or Gilbert Winter or something like that, I just sort of ate it up and played it to the best of my ability. I didn't really know much about it.
We've got together at our advanced ages and learnt and recorded what were new pieces to us. Do you think there's anything different from our approach now to, 60, 70 years ago when we first started playing together?
Probably not. I think enjoyment of music, it certainly can be intellectual, and it certainly can be technical, but there are other parts of it which are more intuitive. I think raking around and finding things is quite interesting. I think there are some further pieces by, I think it may be Peter Eben. And then they're miniatures, but they're so beautifully crafted.
Yeah. We'll have to get those out again, won't we? That's about all for today, but if you like what you've heard, you can access the recordings of Holloway, St Jacome and Bellon duets through the International Trumpet Guild website. You can hear and see more of John Miller's work, including this book, published by Boydell and Brewer, The Modern Brass Ensemble in 20th Century Britain. So, John, thank you very much for spending time with me this afternoon.
Thank you very much indeed. What a pleasure.
Thanks to John Miller for coming to talk with me today. Lots to ponder. Goodbye till next time.